acknowledge the First Nations owners of the land on which we all live. I thank them for their millennia of care for its lands, waters, and skies, under which all its beings, from the stones and rivers to bandicoots and kingfishers, thrived. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and stand in solidarity with them as they raise their future leaders in strength. My name's Michelle Burkon. I live on the land of the Mura people that we call Maroubra. I represent here Jews Against the Occupation 48. This webinar is an initiative of Eastern Suburbs of Palestine, which is a group established by JO 48 to challenge Zionist dominance in this area of Sydney. I'd like to welcome our speakers for tonight, Ahmed Abadla, Shula Kirovsky, and Ronit Lenton. Our other speaker, Subhi Awad, is unwell and cannot attend. As he was to have spoken about the Nakba and its consequences for the Palestinians, and thus provide the context for our other speakers, I will give a brief overview of the meaning and history of the Nakba, although I obviously cannot speak at all of the Palestinian experience. Nakba means catastrophe. The term is used to describe not only the events of 1947-48, but the ongoing persecution and displacement of Palestinians by Israel. It covers the fracturing of Palestinian society and the long-running denial of their right of return for Palestinian refugees and their descendants. The Nakba began some months before the 1948 war with a campaign of atrocities calculated to terrify the Palestinian population into leaving their land and homes. There were dozens of massacres. Women were raped, babies and children were brutally murdered, men were rounded up, humiliated, and executed. Village wells were poisoned. Over 500 towns, villages, and urban neighbourhoods were depopulated. Many were razed to the ground and all traces obliterated by forests planted by the Jewish National Fund. Others were repopulated by Jews and given new Hebrew names. Approximately half of Palestine's predominantly Arab population, around 750,000 people, was expelled through various violent means, at first by Zionist paramilitaries, and then after the establishment of the State of Israel, by those same soldiers in the uniform of the Israeli Defense Force. By the end of the war, 78% of the total land of former Mandatory Palestine was controlled by Israel. Not only did the Zionist colonization of Palestine deprive the Palestinians of their land, property, and belongings, it fragmented and destroyed their society, suppressed their culture and identity, and has denied their political rights and national aspirations. So with that context in mind, let's move on to our second speaker, who is Ahmed Abadla. Ahmed is a Palestinian from Gaza. He was born and grew up in Gaza, and he now lives in Sydney. Ahmed would speak about his perspective as a Palestinian on what the colonial state of Israel, the Zionist project, meant for Palestinian people. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. Hi, everyone. My name is Ahmed. I also want to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are all dialing in from today, and pay my respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. This land was never ceded, always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We are meeting all today on a ground zero of a genocide that occurred more than 200 years ago, and its echoes still reverberate to our day. I'm dialing in from Camaragal country. Thanks again, Michelle, and thanks for inviting me to speak on this brilliant panel. The title of today's event is Myth Busting, Israel, Palestine, and I intend to address 5 of those myths that are highlighted and outlined on the event from a Palestinian perspective. Growing up in Gaza, it is not uncommon to think of the entire Palestinian struggle for liberation as a religious one, living in a predominantly Muslim society, even before Hamas started to become part of the political and social Palestinian fabric. The divinity of that place was and still is an integral part of our lives. There's no denying that. This is equally true for the smaller percentage of Christian Palestinians who live in Gaza, the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and inside the state of Israel. Admittedly, it is also equally true for Jewish Palestinians who lived in historic Palestine in the early stages of the 20th century and before. There should be no denying that either. And as a well-established historical fact, followers of all those monotheistic religions did live in harmony as one community, as one group in the early 20th century and before. And religion back then was never a determining factor in the relationship with one another back then. But something happened, something that disturbed this harmony happened. A new ideology that was gaining momentum in the West and in Europe in particular in the early 20th century, an ideology that used and abused the hate and persecution of the Jewish religion and the Jewish people in Europe, and in many ways bolstered that hate and persecution, appealing to the interests of the main imperialist powers at the time as part of maintaining their system of control in the region coming out of the First World War. An ideology that managed to establish the perfect marriage between religious misrepresentation and misinterpretation of the Jews on the one hand, and imperialist capitalistic doctrines on the other, in order to achieve the end goal of establishing a Jewish state in Palestine, where the Jewish Arab population did not even account for 10% of the overall population in historic Palestine at the time. That proposition, its implementation on the ground in the early 20th century, planted the seed of that division and conflict between the Arab community there and the newcomers who adopted this ideology. And when I say Arab, I actually mean Jewish, Christian, and Muslim Arabs. There was no other distinction between them as being one nation regardless of religion. The implantation of Zionism in Palestine led directly to this wide belief that this is a religious conflict. Zionism sought to create a brand new nation out of a religion and eventually dominate the entire region from the Jordanian River to the Mediterranean Sea. It created this system of indoctrination that Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro describes as transforming the Jews into Zionists, which are completely two different things. At the very core of this ideology lied the main reason of its endeavors, namely that Jews are foreigners in the countries in which they are at home, meaning that Jews can never assimilate in the societies they live in due to some sort of deficiency they have, or some sort of incompetency. This was the Zionist doctrine. Many Zionist leaders were blatantly outspoken about such reasons, including Vladimir Jabotinsky, Theodor Herzl, even Ben-Gurion himself. We know these figures were not even close to being religious. And that reasoning to me sounds like a blatant form of racism against the Jews. That to me sounds anti-Semitic, actually. You know, as Edwin Montague, a Jewish anti-Zionist leader at the early 20th century, said in response to Balfour Declaration 1917, he said, quote, "The policy," that's Balfour Declaration, "of His Majesty's government is anti-Semitic, and in result will prove a rallying ground for anti-Semites in every country in the world. He described Zionism as a mischievous political creed. And he went on to say, the sympathy which the president of the local government board suggests is widespread and deep-rooted in the Protestant worlds, with the idea of restoring the Hebrew people to the land which was to be their inheritance, is, I fear, very often a thinly cloaked desire to get rid of the Jewish ingredient in Protestant population. And so we shouldn't be surprised to see a large proportion of anti-Semites actively advocating for Zionism and for the state of Israel as a whole. Why am I mentioning this historical context? Going back to one of the main talking points of this discussion, there has never been an old age religious conflict in the region. There has been no religious conflict whatsoever with Judaism in Palestine until the advent of this racist supremacist ideology that repackaged, not only wrongly as a nation, repackaged the Jews as a nation, but as a supreme nation that has the sole monopoly over the entirety of the land of historic Palestine. And so criticizing Israel as a country that was founded upon Zionism is not only anti-Semitic, but I'd argue that advocating for the continuation of promoting Israel as a Jewish supremacist state is in and of itself anti-Semitic and an insult to all the Jews around the world that such a state is considered their representative and claims to speak on their behalf. And so flatly associating the world Jews with such an apartheid structure, with such a violent settler colonial regime, with such a genocidal, rogue, unholy state, is in and of itself anti-Semitic and an affront to any righteous Jewish person on this planet. In that sense, Israel has never meant to be a liberal democracy. A liberal democratic country offers equal rights and freedom of political, social, and economic contribution to all of its citizens. This is absolutely not true in Israel. And it is enshrined in the constitution in Israel that Israel is a democracy of the Jewish people and not democracy of its own citizens. And this is why we see many human rights organizations labeling it as an apartheid state. You live in an Israeli democratic society and you enjoy democracy, equality, and freedom only if you are a Jew. And therefore, when viewing the state of Israel as nakedly for what it fundamentally is, being about completely replacing the indigenous Palestinian people with the world Jewish people, and going through the historical records and monitoring the facts on the ground, Israel has never had peace as an end goal with the Palestinians, Christians and Muslims. Peace processes and efforts in that directions were always meant to remain as efforts and processes, especially when they're sponsored by Israel's enabling imperialist allies. Which takes me to my final point: resistance. Resistance to apartheid, resistance to this system of ever-expanding colonization of Palestine, resistance to occupation, to oppression, and to supremacy. It is mainly due to the conflating criticism of Israel and anti-Jewish sentiments, and intentionally conflating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, that all of Palestinian acts of resistance are rejected as anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic. I'm not going to talk about the rich history of art and cultural types of resistance, political resistance, boycott movements, popular strikes, demonstrations in the face of occupation and colonization, all the way to armed resistance. Palestinians have a rich, diverse history of resistance against system of occupation, colonization, and apartheid, peacefully or otherwise. And violent resistance was always the last resort, because let's face it, Palestinians know that their struggle is against a nuclear power. And so violent and armed resistance has always been the last resort, when all other non-violent means were exhausted. You know, colonization generally is inherently violent. Historically speaking, when researching the Algerian experience with colonization, Vietnam's experience, South African's experience on this continent, you know, someone said once the ethnic cleansing and genocide is the bread and butter of settler colonialism. When studying that history, all you find is violence against the indigenous population, and in reaction, resistance, violent resistance in response. The main common factor of all these types of Palestinian resistance, historically speaking, was that they were pointed at the Zionist project. The Palestinians have always been aware of the distinction between being a Jew and being a Zionist colonizer. Even in Hamas's updated charter published in 2017, the language directly points to this racist ideology and clearly says that. And I'm quoting from that charter: Hamas affirms that its conflict is with the Zionist project, not with the Jews because of their religion. Hamas does not wage a struggle against the Jews because they are Jewish, but wages a struggle against the Zionists who occupy Palestine. Yet it is the Zionists who constantly identify Judaism and the Jews with their own colonial project and illegal entity. This is out of Hamas's charter. For some people, this is pretty surprising. But the truth is, for all Palestinian organizations, all Palestinian resistance organizations, throughout their history of struggle against the state of Israel, that was the case. The resistance was pointed at the Zionist settler colonial regime, the Zionist settler colonial project. In an interview with Al Jazeera, Ahmed Yassin, the founder of Hamas, the infamous Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, once said that if a Muslim country did the exact same thing as Israel is doing to the Palestinians, they will face the exact same level of resistance, armed or otherwise. So at the basic sentiment, this is a nationalistic movement packaged in an Islamist garb, but at the core of it, Hamas is about the national ambitions of the Palestinians, and it's a continuation of a rich history of resistance. And so, for example, in Gaza, 17 years of imprisonment, of isolation, of besiegement, of being put on a calorific diet, of restricting movement, of dehumanization, oppression, massacre after massacre for 17 years, it is inevitable, almost impossible, not to generate resistance, and not to generate violent resistance for that matter. Especially when more than 80% of the Gazan population were the descendants of refugees that were displaced and ethnically cleansed from their land in 1948. It'll actually be surprising not to see this level of resistance specifically coming from Gaza. October the 7th, to me and to many, was inevitable. You know, Hamas as a resistance movement, as an anti-colonial liberation movement, originated from those refugee camps in Gaza. It was created in that hostile, occupied environment, launching itself as a religio-national resistance movement. It clearly oriented itself as an extension to the long, rich history of the Palestinian struggle against occupation and colonization. But in general, any Palestinian movement that clenches to this ideology of resistance will never be accepted by the Zionist regime. You always hear us Palestinians say our existence is resistance, and that's true. We resist to survive elimination and ethnic cleansing. And so it is safe to say and to conclude that Israel does not really have a Hamas problem as it proclaims right now, or Islamic Jihad problem. It has a resistance problem, and therefore it has Palestinian existence problem. Israel uses Hamas and other resistance movements throughout the history as a fig leaf to intimidate Palestinians into submission. And so I'll end on the following. A permanent resolution to what is commonly referred to as conflict and what should be referred to as settler colonial and apartheid violence. A resolution to all that is tied to one thing and one thing only: the eradication of the ideology of Zionism. Zionism is the worst form of racism, and we see it manifesting now in Gaza. Racism and Zionism must be fought and eliminated, and it is not enough to be non-Zionist. We all must be anti-Zionist. Only without Zionism can there be equality, justice, and freedom for all, from the river to the sea. And this is what that slogan means. Thank you for listening to me, and I look forward to the Q&A with you.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. Your words are, as always, humbling in the depth of your knowledge and the extent of your compassion and understanding for all of the people between the river and the sea. Our second speaker is Shula Kirovsky. Shula will focus on her personal experience of coming from living in a religious Zionist settlement in the occupied West Bank as a child to her current anti-Zionist politics, rooted in the long and honourable anti-Zionist Jewish movements that existed ever since the inception of Zionism. She will briefly outline how the West Bank came to be, the West Bank, its history, the myths, and then move on to the dire situation that we're currently all aware of. She will emphasize that the settlements of the West Bank follow the same pattern of Zionist colonization and occupation since ever that pernicious ideology appeared in Palestine. So thank you very much, Shula.
Hello. Hi, everyone. I'm Shula, joining today from Gadigaland, which was stolen by colonizers. This land was never ceded and always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And this is actually the my understanding of where I've been living in the past 15 years, that this is stolen land with history of colonization. Later brought me to understand the colonization of Palestine, a place where I was born. I will speak perhaps more from a personal experience, just because I don't have the depth of knowledge as some of the other speakers, but hopefully that personal experience will expose, as it is now with my anti-Zionist understanding, expose to me the real issues, which are often framed as complicated. You're not from there, so you want to understand, and all the myths that Ahmed has mentioned and that we could see in the title of the flight, it's a religious conflict, or that it's a democracy, or that the Palestinians have lived there. So I might just go through that. The one thing, one of the moments that probably really I can very clearly remember, recent moments that I clearly remember when it changed my mind was actually from another anti-Zionist Jewish person, and it's Ronit Lentin. It was when I was walking by 2 years ago or so, and there was a Palestinian pro-Palestine rally. At the time, it was a small one. Right now, they're much bigger, I guess, because the Gaza uprising has exposed to many more people, and to myself as well, the nature of the Zionist settler colony of Israel. Ronit Lentin at the time, I remember I saw, it was after actually a recent visit to apartheid Israel, to visit some friends. And I came back that visit as an adult, just brought me some questions that I couldn't even articulate myself completely, because I did not had a understanding of what was it that I saw. And I didn't see anything, actually. I didn't go anywhere. I saw anything. What was striking was when I went through a Palestinian village that was right next to a Jewish kibbutz in what I guess the 48 area. So, and how the difference between that, I just saw apartheid. There was a difference in how the roads, how well were maintained in a Jewish village, and how they were not looked after in a Palestinian village right next door. And you can just see the divide. Those kind of question actually made me stop and listen in that rally 2 years ago, and just be uncomfortable, because I realized that there was something that the way I grew up, certain paradigms that were just instilled in how I grew up did not reflect reality. And that's when I met Ronit, and she brought me to look into this conflict as a colonization. So I was born in the north of Palestine, in apartheid Israel, in a town called Safed. Before 1948, it was a place where different communities, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim, lived in the same city for generations, for centuries. And until Zionism came, and I'm not talking about just 1948, but before that, again, as Ahmed mentioned, there was no issues there, none that brought to massacres, like we saw with, like, if you learn about any of the Zionist massacres that were committed, it's just every day I'm learning more and more, and it's just horrible to find out, although by now completely not surprising. So Safed was one of the first places that was, as part of the north, was one of the first places that was taken over, and Palestinians were expelled and massacred. As I believe it was Plan Dalet, that was called. Dalet is the Hebrew letter, the fourth Hebrew letter of the alphabet, so it means the plan number 4. The later on, I also lived in, my family moved to Jewish settlement in the West Bank. Now, at the time, as a child, that's where my first memories are. At the time, that's not how I was told where I am. I only around 2 years ago, I actually found out where was it that I lived. It was occupied West Bank, of course, but more than more than that, the whole Safed as well is an occupied land. So the difference between West Bank or the rest of Palestine is only when was it colonized, when it's being taken over, and not the illegality and immorality of it is the same. So in one story that I'd like just, I guess, to mention from my childhood that I never really understood until recently what was going on. So my memory is that there were soldiers that came to this to the settlement, and as in the Israeli occupation forces, and were and the community was told that they have to move these caravans from the hill where they built them to try to expand the settlement down to the valley. There was a whole uproar because the community was what's, I guess, religious Zionists. Those, if you see some of those that are in power now in the government in the state of Israel, they live like Smotrich, perhaps you've heard of him. They live themselves. They currently they live in occupied West Bank, in those kind of settlements, and these Zionist settlements started as soon as the I guess Six-Day War finished in 1967, and they took colonized the rest of Palestine, and these Zionist settlements, the settlement I grew up there was called Kochav HaShachar. It still exists. It's basically between Ramallah and Jericho. Jericho. It was taken over, confiscated. The land was confiscated from two Palestinian villages nearby, Der Harir and Kafr Malik, if I'm pronouncing it all correctly. In 1979, this was first an army, Israeli occupation army outpost. Later on was turned into a settlement, and now it's only growing, really, like all the settlements there. So my personal story with that, I did not, of course, as a child, understand why they're soldiers, or this was normal. This was considered normal, that they're there, that we are there, and that also that this whole area we just called it the land of Israel. There was no differentiation really. And therefore, in my memory, that's where I lived. As of course, that's not really the case in reality. Even by international law, it's from day one, it's considered as military occupied territory. And a lot of from my understanding as well, a lot of Israelis do not understand where actually these occupied territories begin or end. Palestinians, though, they feel that on themselves, with the apartheid wall that's been built, with the roads that are Jewish only roads, and also highways that are built only for the settlers, so they don't need to look Palestinians on the way to their work in the West Bank. So I guess I want to go into next is that this occupation the conflict really is about taking more and more land, occupying more and more of territory by any means necessary, whatever there is an opportunity. In 1956, David Ben-Gurion, the first the Zionist, one of the leaders, he said, and there's a quote, "Jordan has no right to exist. The territory to the west of the Jordan should be made an autonomous region of Israel." So the idea of occupying more land was always in Zionist ideas. They just 1948 they only agreed to that because to this partition plan because they thought we will conquer more, as they're doing now, as they've done since then. Now, of course, the situation in the occupied West Bank is only getting worse. Smotrich just this Monday, I believe, said that he's hoping to push for sovereignty over the occupied territories, and he's as defense ministry. He actually oversees the administration of the occupied West Bank and settlements. Currently, there is the olive harvest that happens. This season it comes to an end, but the violence has been huge. If you follow any there are various accounts or organizations and activists, Palestinians and international ones, that document daily harassment that's perpetrated by the army. I mean, directly more by the settlers, but the army enable it, and they actually, a lot of those who are in the occupation as occupation forces in the West Bank, they are settlers themselves. So they're just in cahoots together. The state itself also supports this. And again, I can tell you about that more from personal experience. Since for some years when we lived in this Jewish settlement, my family was actually able to get extra health care benefits that even other Israelis don't get unless you live in the occupied West Bank. So this was, my mom said she found out only once we moved away from that, and then she assumed that that's what everyone gets. And then she found out it was only extra special benefits this was back in the 90s, when there was supposedly a peace. Israel was seeking peace. This peace, in practice, we can see that that's exactly not what Israel was seeking. It was seeking to find a way to legitimize its occupation and to divide the territory even more in this, I guess, divide and conquer strategy. So they divide the areas into A, B, C, or it's so making it more and more complicated for Palestinians to even move around in their own towns, between different towns. Checkpoints are put up randomly. There is it's all of that is designed to make life there harder and harder, so that in the hope of the Zionist colony is to get Palestinians to move away from there, to make it harder to live. And it is happening, unfortunately. Now we moved away from that settlement after a couple of years because, as my parents said, they found it too Zionist. We grew up, my family, myself, we were actually, they were immigrants from the Soviet Union. They became religious. My parents didn't grow up Jewish religions, but they became religious with the Soviet Union falling apart, and they wanted to find some, meaning in their life. They found that in Jewish religion. My mom says that when she grew up, that's again just more personal from my life. I'm only sharing it so that it hoped to make sense. When the Soviet Union fell apart, she was able to access, there was radio stations in Russian that was set up by Israel, talking about Jewish history, talking about all of that, of course, from a Zionist perspective. And all of that, always, she said, came to a conclusion that where Jews should move, they should move to Israel. That's the ultimate kind of best thing to do as a Jewish person. And yeah, I guess, she says she fell for that and moved but living in what is occupied land. She did say that the reality shown her that there are people already lived here. The promise, the myth that this was a land without a people that she was told was absolutely false. We later moved back to Russia, and now we live here. So my experience, I guess, my memories are only until I was 5. It is a beautiful place. I can definitely understand and feel it's still, I remember its beauty. But as an adult, when I went there, as I said recently, it felt there was something that I could feel in the air. It was wrong and I could not articulate until I saw it from the light, from understanding as a colonization. This was the beauty of the land is being destroyed by Zionism. Zionism is also definitely taking over Judaism and wants to present itself as Judaism. A lot of growing up, I grew up in a more kind of very religious, Orthodox, you could classify as ultra-Orthodox community, that there are ultra-Orthodox communities that are anti-Zionist, but the one I grew up in was not necessarily Zionist, neither we were really anti-Zionist, but a lot of Zionist ideas were infiltrated. The idea that the Holy Land means a state that we did not really think of ourselves as Zionists, but a lot of what they did support settlements. So they tried to cloak it in that. I just wanted to end with a quote I recently came across from actually a Zionist figure, but from 1926. She was from Manya Shochat in 1926 in a private letter. She was in a leader in a Zionist movement, and specifically with the idea of the kibbutzim. She really was pushing with that. But she writes this, and actually reading some of these Zionists, what they write, it just shows you that they understood what they were doing. And it's just whether, are you for colonialism? Do you think colonialism is good or is it bad? So she writes, those of us who have seen in our own eyes how elderly Arab women are torn from land that they had held for a long time, land that had been literally soaked with their blood and sweat, and how they are now forced, in old age, to find a new home, can understand how right they are to curse us. Ours is an act of violence, the price of which we are paying today and will continue to pay in the future. Anti-Semitism is an inevitable result, even to the point of armed resistance. She basically describes that, I guess, any of the armed resistance, it's not of Palestinians, it's not the cause of the conflict. It's the result of the colonization by Zionists. It's a reaction to that atrocities that have been committed on Palestinians by Zionism. So I hope my personal experience will helps you to see this differently. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer. And I hope I removed some of those myths that you might have had. But yeah, thank you so much for the time that was given to me.
Thank you so much, Shula. I think personal experience is one of the really crucial ways through which people come to understand what's actually going on in colonized Palestine. Not everybody has the desire to sort of wade through history books, but sometimes when you hear someone speaking, they will just provide you with some little snippet of something that clarifies something that makes it clear to you what this is. You see it, you can challenge what Israel says it is with what it actually is. And that is the key to us freeing ourselves from Zionism, both in the sense of the ideology and for the occupied land of Palestine. I'd now like to turn to our final speaker, who is Ronit Lenton. Ronit was born in Haifa, Palestine, and she grew up in what then became Israel. She will talk about Israel as a settler, colonial, racial, and inherently genocidal project. She's providing the overall glue to hold together all of the things that we've heard tonight. So thank you very much, Ronit.
Thank you very much. That's a heavy load. And thank you very much to Ahmed and Shula for their very cogent talks. I just would like to acknowledge, first of all, the Gadira people on whose land I have moved to only recently, onto stolen land that had never been ceded. And as my predecessor said, this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And it's important to remember it when we talk about Palestine, which always was and always will be Palestinian land as far as I'm concerned. I was born in Palestine, as Michelle said. I was born before the state of Israel because I'm older, to parents who migrated from Romania, whose family, in fact, some of his family did not survive the Romanian Holocaust. I had a regular Zionist upbringing in youth and studied in the Zionist school, went to a Zionist youth movement. I lived in the Palestinian Jewish city of Haifa, but had no Palestinian friends because we really didn't mix, despite all the romantic memories of Jews, Muslims, and Christians living together. Luckily for me, I did not serve in the army because I was released on medical ground, but my brother was an Air Force pilot. And after October 7, he actually stopped talking to me because I mentioned the word anti-Zionist. In fact, for me, only after the 67 war, in my early 20s, upon meeting a group of anti-Zionist socialist, Jewish, and Palestinian group called Matzpen, did I understand the Zionist movement was not a national liberation movement, as we were told, but rather an imperialist, colonialist project. I just want, before I start talking about some theory, remind you some of the facts of what's happening in Gaza. More than a year into the genocide, now is another moment of deep grief and profound screaming rage. as a Zionist entity, and I choose to call it the Zionist entity and not Israel, is intent on eliminating the Palestinian population from northern Gaza. The official death toll is over 44,000 people, mostly women and children. But there's huge number of injured people, and 2 million people are displaced, which is 90% of the population of Gaza. These horrific numbers do not include people buried under the rubble or people who died from hunger or disease. More realistic estimates are between 200,000 and 500,000, which is a quarter of the size of the Gaza population. Only last Sunday, some 50 people, a third of them children, were massacred by an Israeli strike of a multi-story residential building housing 6 forcibly displaced Palestinian families in the northern Gaza city of Beit Lahia. And we can go on and on, but remember that while perpetrating the Gaza genocide, the Zionist entity also killed 750 Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, and Jewish settlers continue to harass Palestinian population, demolish their homes, and expel them. And meanwhile, the construction of illegal Jewish settlements is progressing apace. There are about 11,000 Palestinian hostages held in Israeli prisons, and this includes over 3,000 administrative detainees who are held without charge or trial. Now, to grasp the enormity of the destruction of Gaza, remember that the Zionist entity has actually completely flattened the Gaza Strip, built roads, expelled and deliberately starved the population. And even the entity's own politicians are admitting it is ethnically cleansing Gaza as we speak. And I've been a pro-Palestine activist since after the '67 war, many years in Ireland where I lived, and I feel very passionate about the Palestinian quest for freedom, and I'm deeply disturbed by former country barbarities. As an academic, I've written a lot about it, so let me outline some of the points which are important to remember. Some of them made by Ahmad, but I hope I'll add some. First of all, many Zionists, both Jews and non-Jews, believe that Zionism came about as a solution to the Jewish problem of European anti-Semitism. Sorry, I have a frog in my throat. European anti-Semitism was indeed the problem, culminating in the Nazi Holocaust. But Zionism came about as a European colonialist project at the end of the 19th century. Note that the early Zionists themselves explicitly cast the project in settler colonial terms. They called the pre-state polity Yishuv, and Yishuv in Hebrew means settlement or colony. In the first Zionist project, a Congress in 1897, when they voted on Jewish immigration to Palestine, they spoke about establishing 3 types of colonies in Palestine: kibbutz, which is a communal settlement, moshav, which is the collective settlement, and town. Colonization was actually not a dirty word then. It was actually the aim of the Zionist settlement in Palestine. And like all other settler colonial projects, Zionism intended to eliminate the native population. And this has been demonstrated amongst other places in Australia, in the United States, in Canada, and written about by the Australian scholar Patrick Wolf. But from the very beginning, Zionism was also a racial project. Race here is not biological or cultural, but rather a set of political processes that differentiate between people who are fully human, not quite human, and non-human. The race scholar Alana Lentin writes, race is a technology of human differentiation, the main aim of which is reproducing and maintaining white supremacy. Let it sink in. Race is about maintaining white European supremacy. Now, the Zionist entity not only rules Palestinians through practices of exception, necessity, and security, which is aided by a whole slew of emergency laws inherited from British colonialism. It also separates between Palestinian citizens, which is called 48 Palestinians, occupied subjects, which are 67 Palestinians, and refugees. And he ruled them through technologies of apartheid, segregation, exclusion, and surveillance, which have been employed ever since the 1948 Plan Dalet or Plan D for the elimination of Palestinian natives. And this has been clearly set out, and it is outlined by the famous Israeli historian Ilan Pappé, about whom you might have heard. But paradoxically, for a group of people who've been racialized and oppressed by Christian European, Zionist Jews racialized not only the colonized Palestinians, but also non-European Mizrahi, Arab, and Black Jews, as well as non-European, non-Jewish migrants and asylum seekers. And this constructs a classic racial state. Now, racial states, as the Jewish race scholar David Theo Goldberg says, excludes and includes in racial terms in order to construct homogeneity, which actually he calls it heterogeneity in denial. They do it through various technologies such as border controls, immigration policies, military and police forces, citizenship regimes, surveillance strategies, and census categorization, but also through invented histories and traditions. And these construct state narratives, state history, and state memory, as well as the evocation of ancient myths. Now, Zionism has used the ancient biblical myths as if this was the origin of all Jews, but more recently, more scholars have actually put some doubt upon all these things we all grew up about. Abraham, Jacob, and Joseph, and Isaac, and the prophets, and so on and so forth. All of this is a set of stories to create a nation. Goldberg argues something else which is interesting. He said the law doesn't serve the citizens, but it serves the racial state itself. And in fact, in the Zionist entities, about 55 racial Zionist laws. I just list a couple of them so you'll see the depth of racial rule. The first one is the 1950 Law of Return that grants anyone with Jewish parents or grandparents automatic citizenship, while not granting Palestinians born on the land the right of return. Then there is the 1950 Absentees Property Law that grants the state ownership of the property of Palestinians who were expropriated in 1948, and it calls them present absentees. Now, they were present because some people remained after the Nakba, but they were considered absentees. Then there's a Jewish National Fund Law, which I think Ahmed mentioned, of 1953, and that charges Zionist Land Purchasing Agency with purchasing and administrating public land, which became state lands, and bars its selling to non-Jews, i.e. Palestinians. And the result is that 93% of all public lands are in fact owned either by the state or by the JNF or by Jews. And finally, the most notorious one is the 2018 Nation State Bill, and that enshrines Israel as the land of the Jewish people, and this enshrined it in law, and Netanyahu was able to say after the law, Israel is not a state of all its citizens. According to the nation state law that we passed, Israel is a nation state of the Jewish people and them alone. And that totally refutes the existence of Israel's Palestinian citizens, who make up 20% of the state's population. Now, this racial rule led to an explicit genocidal plan for the people of Gaza long before October 7. Speaking in 2014, the extreme right-wing Knesset member, Moshe Feiglin, said that the Israeli army will, and listen to the language, designate open areas in the Sinai desert in which the civilian population of Gaza will be concentrated in tent encampments until relevant immigration destinations are determined. The supply of electricity and water will be disconnected, and the formerly populated areas will be shelled with maximum firepower. The Israeli army would then exterminate nests of resistance and those who insist on staying will be required to publicly sign a declaration of loyalty to Israel. Some of the language, exterminating, concentrating, etc., we've heard that before, haven't we? And such plans are, in fact, today voiced all the time by right-wing politicians who are planning definitely to eliminate all of Gaza's population and to resettle the whole Gaza Strip by Jewish people. Now, remember, according to Patrick Wolf, settler colonialism is characterized by a logic of elimination, and it destroys and replaces what it destroys. So the Zionist logic of elimination was evident by expelling 800,000, some say 750, some say 800,000 Palestinians during the 1948 Nakba, the replacement of 500 Palestinian villages and urban neighborhoods by Jewish settlements, and also by the entity's perpetual war against the Palestinian people. But very paradoxically, for people who suffered racialization, the Zionist ideology itself articulates the Jewish race. Many prominent Jewish leaders from the Zionist leaders from the beginning, including Theodor Herzl, Max Nordau, Arthur Rupin, insisted, just like the Nazis, that Jews are actually a race. Thus, Prime Minister Begin could say in 1982 that our race is a master race. We are divine gods on this planet. We are as different from the inferior races as they are from insects. In fact, compared to our race, other races are beasts and animals. They are excrement. Our destiny is to rule over the inferior races, and their masses will lick our feet and serve us as our slaves. Amazing language. The Zionist entity then is a deeply racialized settler colonial apartheid regime. And as such, I personally firmly believe it should be dismantled. Not that people should be killed, but that the polity should be dismantled and replaced with an alternative political entity, which should be led by the Palestinians, where Palestinians, Israelis, Muslims, Christians, and Jews can live together in equality and dignity. Now, just to conclude briefly, we have a couple of minutes. I want to speak briefly about resistance. I'm very glad that Ahmed talked about it. But I want to remind you that resistance to colonization has persisted long before the Nakba. For instance, between 1936 and 1939, opposing the arrival of Jewish settlers, Palestinians staged the Great Palestinian Revolt. It was suppressed by the British and by the Zionist militias, but this did not prevent many Palestinians from taking part in defending their villages and towns against Zionist attacks during the 1948 Nakba. After the 1967 occupation, there were two noteworthy major acts of resistance, the two Palestinian intifadas. The first one was largely unarmed and lasted from 1987 to 1993 in the West Bank and in Gaza. It was brutally repressed by Israel, killing almost 1,100 Palestinians, including 240 children. The second intifada was an armed uprising, and both intifadas are hailed by pro-Palestinian protesters. Don't we all chant in our rallies? There's only one solution: intifada, revolution. In Gaza, the 2018-2019 Great March of Return was a series of demonstrations held each Friday near the Gaza-Israel border, in which protesters demanded not just the improvement of the conditions in Gaza and the lifting of the siege, but the abolition of the siege and the return of all Palestinian refugees to lands that were displaced from. And then the Israeli forces killed 223 Palestinians. Basically, they stood there and shot at unarmed people and maimed hundreds of them. In fact, it's truly remarkable that the Palestinian insurgents, despite their small numbers and lack of advanced military hardware and the impossibly difficult conditions from which they launched their attack on October 7th, have succeeded in preventing the numerically superior, better equipped and Western funded Israeli army from achieving victory. In fact, just yesterday, an article was published in Haaretz newspaper in the entity, saying that basically Israel has not managed to win over Hamas. Now, importantly, calling this act of guerrilla resistance Gaza's Warsaw Uprising moment, the Gaza academic Haidar Eid wrote already on October 10th, 2023, and I quote, "Instead of waiting for Israel's generosity when it decides through mediators to open one of the 7 gates of the largest open-air prison on earth, the inmates, having learned from the Warsaw Ghetto uprising of 1944, decided to bring it down themselves. The resistant movements in Gaza, right and left, have decided to turn the tables upside down. They have given the Palestinian struggle a new impetus, a clear direction towards liberation and decolonization." So I just want to make one point to end. We must bear in mind that all the ongoing wonderful solidarity work by countless supporters throughout the world, including many Jewish anti-Zionist activists, and that includes me, a Palestinian-born Jewish former settler turned pro-Palestine activist, all of this pales into insignificance by comparison with the powerful Palestinian resistance, courage, and sumud, which is steadfastness, in the face of the appalling genocide inflicted upon Gaza and its people by the Zionist racial colony and its Western imperial capital sponsors. Thank you so much, and I look forward to discussing with you.
Well, thank you so much, Ronit. That's a really powerful talk, and I think it's really important to establish the context in which we see the ongoing violence against the Palestinian people since, well, certainly before 1948. And for us to sort of be able to see that pattern, that overall pattern that we see in colonies around the world. So Israel is a colony in the process of its destruction, just as other colonies have come and gone and are still in the process of being dismantled. Of course, indeed, as Ronit says, the primary burden of suffering and dispossession and all of the other crimes rests upon the Palestinian people. And I want to really thank Ahmed for always being reminding us of the courage and dignity of Palestinian resistance. Ahmed, can you know what to sort of, we have a question here, and I'm wondering if you would like to answer that. Maybe we could first have an answer from Ahmed, and maybe Ronit might like to tackle it in a different way. The question is this, from Eileen Whitehead: how can the Palestinians ever get justice while the US supports the genocide that is happening in Gaza? Netanyahu and his Zionist right-wing government is simply ignoring the United Nations and the ICC. So maybe Ahmed, perhaps I'd like to see perhaps address the issue of Zionist right-wing government, whether that's actually the issue. Thank you.
I mean, I can address the US support. I mean, US has always been the sponsor of Israel, and over the years, Israel's reputation and global support has eroded immensely. And we find Israel and the US by themselves isolated as a pariah states, not heeding the demands from the international community. And, you know, to delve into the history, I think when South Africa apartheid was in place, the US was the last country to concede and, you know, to stop supporting apartheid. And I think as we mobilize more, as we campaign more for the BDS, pushing for sanctions, as pushing our own governments to comply with the enormous ICJ rulings, I think other countries can take control and eventually force that support of the US to relent. But I think we can't just have that. I mean, I personally refuse to have that defeatist understanding that as long as the US support with with Israel is there, we're never gonna achieve justice and equality. I think the more pressure we put on our own governments, the more we push for BDS, the more we campaign and mobilize and educate. I think eventually the US will find it will find it more expensive, more costly to continue that support, especially because the US is actually built on corporate money and capitalism. And if we actually target that side of the economic relations, the US is eventually will relent. So that's my take on that question.
Do you have anything to add to that, Ronit?
Yes, it's important to remember that Netanyahu's right-wing government is only a symptom and not the cause. Israel's Zionist entities policy have started from so-called socialist government from the very start. One of the worst offenders was David Ben-Gurion, its first prime minister. But the good thing about what's happening in the Zionist entity at the moment is that it's falling to pieces. The economy is on its knees. People have been in reserve duty for months and months. Businesses have closed. The high-tech sector is in bits, and people are leaving the country to go to emigrate abroad. So we can hope somewhat that the entity will implode from inside. I'm not hanging much hope on the new president in the United States, but Biden and Harris were just as bad. They actually bankrolled the genocide. So I think to actually the question is wrong, because it's neither the right-wing government nor the states, because both are actively to blame. But what is happening since 7th October is the majority of these Israeli citizens, Jewish citizens, are supporting the continuation of the genocide with enthusiasm. And it is absolutely sick-making. So I think we have here a much broader issue, not only of colonization, but the total racism and hatred of anything who is Arab, who is Palestinian, who is not us. And this is a much larger problem.
Thank you, Ronit. Thank you, Ahmed. We have a second question here from Tim Cook. The first Hamas charter had some pretty scary language about killing Jews and didn't really distinguish between Jews and Zionists. The more recent charter took that out, but many people think and still believe, that the first charter is still extant. How can we address that issue?
I can have a go at this one. Thank you very much, Tim Cook, for this question. It's a very common question, and you kind of provided half of the answer. Actually, it's an outdated version. I mean, if we are at university and there's a new edition of the book, would you buy the first one or the second one? I mean, the first one was full of anti-Semitic tropes that are actually been recycled from Europe anti-Semitism, and the tropes borrowed actually from Eastern Europe anti-Semitic sentiments. And to talk about Hamas as a political group, as an organization representative of the Palestinian struggle, all political parties, all social parties go through phases of evolution. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the Labour Party didn't have the ideologies and the understandings that they have now towards, for example, LGBTQ communities and so on and so forth. So when you look at Hamas as as a political party that has evolved through its phases of politics. You know, Hamas never had a political structure, but it learned how to build that structure through the years, all the way from the 90s into the beginning of 2000s, and then all the way to 2017, when it actually matured enough to see that it's actually part of a global community and it cannot continue to have these kind of document attached to it. It's not just Hamas woke up all of a sudden in 2017 and found out that there is anti-Semitism in that document. This took years in the making. Hamas has realized earlier in the piece, from the beginning, like I said, Ahmed Yassin was assassinated in 2004. So way before that, that understanding in Hamas that their fight is against Zionism and the ideology of colonization rather than the Jews has always been entrenched into the movement. The reason why that first charter was written, I'm not really aware of the implications of that, but admittedly, it did include a lot of anti-Semitic tropes that, like I said, Hamas has evolved tremendously from that stage and produced a more representative document of the movement, which can be perceived as a representative of the Palestinian struggle for liberation, really, if you look at it more generally.
Thank you.
May I just add that whenever anybody criticizes the Gaza genocide, the answer is but Hamas, but 7th of October. Now, 7th of October, Ahmed said very, very cogently, was waiting to come. How long should the Palestinians be trampled on? They've been, the Nakba was 76 years ago, 67 was whenever it is, 50, 56 years, 55 years ago, or 50, can't remember, 8 years ago. And the blockade on Gaza has been 17 years. The Palestinians are not at the same position as the Israelis. They don't have the hardware, they don't have but yet they've done extremely well. But then it's not a war between equals. It's a war between colonized and colonizers. And eventually colonization will end, but it'll take a long time. And to blame the colonized for their colonization is very rich. I'm not suggesting there's no anti-Semitism, of course there is. And I'm not suggesting that there was no blame upon Hamas, which are other blames. There are social blames, etc. However, Hamas is the elected force in Gaza, as the Fatah is the elected force with all its drawbacks. And this is what we must work with, not with our imagination.
Thank you, Ronit. I know Shula has an answer here as well. And just because I want to say a couple of words there about relating directly to what Ahmed said, that I recently learned, you know, for example, we're talking about this anti-Semitic language that was directly part of, you know, Tim's question, that when in the 1950s, when Israel was attempting to drive immigration to Israel, because it really wasn't having a whole lot of success. Most of the refugees from the European Holocaust didn't want to go there. They wanted to go to the New World. And the part of the plan was to disrupt the relatively integrated and secure Jewish communities throughout the Arab world. And when the the Zionist sort of infiltrators, I suppose would be the word, were attempting to stir up that trouble, they couldn't find any anti-Semitic texts in Arabic. They were trying to sort of distribute leaflets and stir up, you know, anti-Semitism and all the rest of it in these Arabic communities where Jews were also Arabs. And they had to actually resort to returning to Europe and finding anti-Semitic tracts and having them translated into Arabic in order to disseminate. So it's highly it's not surprising that Hamas or any other organization, when they turn to try to identify the enemy that has oppressed them and is destroying them, will sort of turn to describing that enemy in the only terms that they know. And as Norman Finkelstein said, whose mother and grandmother, and I think his father, were in the concentration camps, in fact, 2 of them were in Auschwitz, he said that to the end of their days, they could not and would not distinguish between German and Nazi, because in their experience, every single German they saw was a Nazi. So for us to be precious about how Hamas defined its enemy all of those years ago, when we ourselves weren't all that keen or clear about defining, the difference between Jews and Zionists, and certainly the State of Israel works extremely hard to completely remove any distinction between the two. It's quite normal and natural that these documents that we issued then, as Ahmed said, before that process of evolution and sophistication came about. Shula, do you have anything to add to that?
No, you actually, the last point you made was what I wanted
Or
to
was
say.
that it? Was it?
Yeah, and specifically, for example, living in a when I lived as in a Jewish settlement, right, in the in occupied Palestine in the West Bank, they specifically is right the entity, Zionist entity, right? If that's probably best to call that, as Ronit mentioned, specifically always positions itself as representative of Jews. So you just see these like the Stars of David and all the various celebrations, various Jewish festivals are used as a way to inflict even more suffering. For example, I know that apparently on like Shabbat, they go around throwing rocks, even though really in Jewish tradition, throwing rocks on Shabbat is prohibited. Shabbat as in the 7th day of the week, Sabbath, day of rest. Various other festivals like Purim, which is a day of celebration, is used to torture more the lives of Palestinians, mocking them. So Israel just goes out of its way to always present itself as Jewish, and then when it leaves and it brings more anti-Semitism because of that, because everyone sees actually the atrocities, and I guess not everyone, but many people, and then the state, the Zionist state says, we are a Jewish state, we're doing this in the name of Jews. Yes, the blame then to me is on Zionism that takes over Judaism and brings on anti-Semitism, because without anti-Semitism, it has even less legitimacy in some people's eyes. It would have actually, yeah. So yes, it's something that the answer is that we as Jewish people, those who identify as such, make that distinction clearer and clearer for everyone. And I'm surprised, I'm always been actually humbled by how much Palestinians are the ones who actually see that distinction the between Zionism and Judaism more than anyone else that I've probably met and talked on the topic. So when people are more concerned with I guess words, then with actual killing and with actual stealing, that's I guess just a bit concerning. Like it's perhaps to me shows a bit of, I guess, some racist mindset where they see some people more important than others, some people's being uncomfortable as more concerning than other people being killed, tortured for decades.
That's
Yeah,
such an
so-
important point. That is so important that this focus on Hamas language, while at the same time Israel is committing genocide. It's unfathomable. We have a couple of questions here, but I'm really conscious that we're running out of time. Is that right, Ahmed? I'm not exactly sure. So I'm going to actually go to a question from Yaakov Aaron, which is that given that Palestinians are not only going through a genocide, but are also often silenced in the media, what role do anti-Zionist Jews play in the Palestinian movement? What is the ethical way for Jewish activists to remain mindful that this is a Palestinian movement at its core? And I'm definitely going to turn that one over to Ahmed.
I was going to actually turn it to Ronit and Shula because, the anti-Zionist voices are important. But yeah,
It's not up to us to decide where our place should be.
I mean, I think it's a mutual struggle, and I also see anti-Zionist voices being blocked in the media and not amplified enough. Maybe they're less so than Palestinians, but I think in that struggle we both help each other and amplify each other's voices, as long as we kind of center the Palestinian, which is mutual demands really for a free Palestine from the river to the sea, and that's free Palestine from racism, which is Zionism, equality, justice, and freedom for everyone. I think we can work together in order to. I like what Ilan Pape once said. For decades and decades, Palestinians, always the Zionists propose, or not even propose, they come up with certain demands and conditions and then force the Palestinians to, or force them on Palestinians. I think now if we want to have that mindset of decolonization, it should be the other way around. It's now the role of the Palestinians to pose their conditions and demands and propose it to the Jewish people who live on that land as part of a consultation process. And then, like I said, there are two peoples right now living in Palestine from the river to the sea. Whoever, if we go through the decolonization process, like what happened in Algeria, the Zionists who remain staunch Zionists who don't want to give up that racist ideology will have to kind of leave and force out. But then if anybody who's willing to coexist per se, and willing to give up that racist ideology, I think we both need to live in that together and build that community together and so on. And so in the West, we should do the same function, in helping each other, amplifying each other's voice.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think it's important to stress that in so-called Australia, there are various groups of anti-Zionist Jews. There's in Sydney itself, I know of two, Jews Against the Occupation, which is the group Michelle belongs to, and Tzedek, which is the group Shula and I belong to. There's also the Jewish Council of Australia, and there's Loud Jews Collective in Melbourne. I'm sure there are others. But I totally agree with Ahmed. Our role is to work on our own approach, but in the struggle to decolonization, we have to be led by the Palestinians. They have to determine what's going to happen with this territory between the river and the sea. And our role as anti-Zionist Jews is to support them in their deliberation. It's not going to be easy because there are going to be discussions between Hamas, Fatah, socialists, communists, conservatives, religious, and so on amongst the Palestinians. It's going to be a process. It's not going to be easy. But our role is to support the Palestinians in their road to decolonization and not to determine what we think is right or wrong. I'm very, very clear about that, Jacob. I hope that you agree with that.
100%, Ronit. I think we've got a few questions here, but I think we'll throw the cat amongst the pigeons here and ask this question from Silicon Mana. Sorry. With all of Israel's advanced AI capabilities, how is it that today I read Netanyahu had issued a 5 million, I don't know if that's shekel or dollar, reward for news of hostages?
What do you think, Renee? I don't know.
I
I
think
got some thoughts.
he'll do
I got
anything
lots of
to
thoughts.
sound bite, and they don't give two thinkers damns about the hostages.
Of
They
course.
kill some of the hostages, and they don't really care. Netanyahu and his government will do anything to remain in power. The hostages have long ceased to play a role in the conduct of this genocide. I'm sorry to say that, and it's awfully sad for the families of the hostages.
Yeah, I mean, I think the language that has been used to promote that proposition is just very clear that they never were interested in negotiation, and they never were interested in hostages. I mean, finding the hostages, not negotiating to actually exchange hostages. So that language is out in the open now. It's very clear. And finding hostages, whether alive or dead, also there's no distinction. So there's less care about the well-being of the hostages and Israeli citizens in general. In terms of how come they couldn't find them when they're the beacon of modernity and sophistication and AI. I've got a simple question. I mean, October the 7th occurred under the watch of all the surveillance and the sophistication. The war has been going on for more than 13 months now. Hamas is still doing a huge amount of damage to the army, and that's just a testament to the capability of Hamas's fighters. Really, it's the answer that not many people want to admit.
I think that we can also say that as well as Ronit said, Netanyahu wants to stay in power. But I think there's an even also another bigger reason behind that is that the ethnic cleansing of Gaza was always in the pipes, was always in the works. So the hostages, the attacks on the October the 7th, no matter what we actually think about the provenance of those attacks, ultimately they were always seen as a pretext for ultimately carrying out this I don't know, final phase, penultimate phase, who knows what they're going to be after next, given what they're doing in Lebanon right now. But yes, I don't think that the hostages figure in anybody's real calculations except the people who love them, That's it. That's really
Can
it.
I add one more thing? I would put it to you that the United States and the Western Empire has an interest in the continuation of the genocide, and that the interest is both strategic and economic, because the armament and security industry is huge. Israel is a big player, and the United States wants to keep Israel going. Rather than saying that Israel is holding the United States by the balls, I think it's the other way around. The United States is calling the shots. This is my view. I can't really go into details in proving it, but this is my view. So there are interests here. This is a very important strategic area.
But Hassan Nasrallah said exactly the same thing. He said that it was very, common. Everybody was like, oh, Israel is the tail that wags the US dog. He said it's exactly the opposite. He said that it's the military industrial complex is behind the whole thing, and the the Israelis might think that they're at the helm, but they're actually not. So I think we're done with that question, have we? How much time do we have, Ahmed?
We could take probably the last question if
Okay.
the two-state solution question sounds appealing.
I think so too, yes. This is from, oh my gosh, we've got a couple of good ones coming in from Jaden Metze and so on, but yeah, I'll have to ask the one that came first from Jay. Do you think it is better to create one state where Israelis and Palestinians live together, or a two-state solution with two distinct communities? In
I
both
think you should
cases.
start, Renate. You were laughing. You were excited about answering the question.
Well, when I lived in Ireland, I was telling my audiences whenever I spoke that Palestine and Israel together is the size of a quarter of Ireland. Now, I can't give you figures in relation to Australia, because Australia is huge. Ireland is a tiny country. In this quarter of Ireland, the province of Munster, there were 1.4 million people in the population. In Israel, Palestine, there's 15 million people, half Palestinians and half Israelis. Now, tell me how you're going to make two states in this tiny area, part of which is not arable. You know, two states is a joke. As Gideon Levy always says, it's a train that long left the station. But having said that, I would like to be led by the Palestinians. Whatever they, after all the negotiations and discussions, come up with, I will be happy for them to go along their quote unquote solution. And I would be happy to support them as long as I live, you know, because not many years left, but I would do what I can to support the Palestinians.
I mean, I can answer that question as well. I mean, on the fundamental level, really, I mean, based to my understanding and based on what I've just mentioned in my brief speech, the root cause of the entire dilemma of Palestine is Zionism. And if we are talking about two-state solution, then we're not eliminating Zionism and racism. And so you will always have that entity that is ever expanding, that is claiming that this is a promised land, that is abusing biblical narratives, and it will always be reacting like a cancerous cell in that region. And so in order to achieve justice and equality for both peoples, whether it's a one state or a two state, the main question is, how do we get rid of that racism between the two people? And that is caused predominantly by Zionism. In order to establish a resolution, I am one of the subscribers of a one-state solution free of Zionism. Free Palestine of Zionism. That's the main, that's the hidden part of the slogan.
Yep, I agree. Although it's not up to me as a Jew, and I certainly not even as a Jew who lives in occupied Palestine, but that's always been an issue for me, that if we look at two-state solution, it's just a bunch of noodles mixed up there together with the way it's been fragmented, and it still relies on the kind of racist division or racialized division between people. There's still two open questions.
I don't know if there are questions.
No, that was one of them says, well, is this statement more interested in causing division within Gaza? I think I'm not quite sure what that was relating to, so I don't think we can really deal with that.
I think we can end here, Michelle.
I think, yeah, I think we're pretty well done here, and I think everybody has been an amazing audience. Like we've got a good selection of questions there, and some one of the things that's really nice to see is one person whose name now I can't find. Oh yeah, Tim Cook is participating from a bus in Japan. And Tim Cook is, from my memory, a Christian who is also a member of Jewish Voice for Peace and does some work with Tzedek and possibly, I know for sure Jewish Voice for Peace in America. And so he's now listening to us while he's on a bus in Japan. Also, thank you very much to the person who wanted to thank the panel for everyone being such wonderful speakers. And I think that's where we can wrap it up. I'd really like to thank Shula and Ronit and Ahmed for helping make this an event. And may Eastern Suburbs of Palestine, Tzedek, Jews Against the Occupation, may we go from strength to strength in decolonizing Palestine.
Thank you, Michelle.
To
Thanks a
the
lot.
sea. Bye-bye.
So much, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.